Pearline hit the ground hard, sand biting her palms, but she didn't cry. She stood, brushed herself off, and looked at the boy still laughing on the swing like a king who'd conquered his throne. 3 days later, when her father walked into Brightwood Elementary, every teacher, parent, and child would learn that the fall they ignored was just the beginning of their reckoning. Before we continue this thrilling story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, like this video and comment where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more powerful stories, and trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now, let's get into the story. The golden Texas sun hung high over Brightwood Elementary like a spotlight waiting for its moment. Children's voices danced through the warm October air, squeals from the monkey bars, laughter bouncing off the slide, the rhythmic creak of swings cutting through it all like a heartbeat. The playground stretched wide under an endless blue sky, rubber mulch soft beneath small feet, everything painted in that perfect light that made childhood look like a movie. 8-year-old Pearline Freeman stood at the edge of the swing set, her dark eyes taking in every detail. She wasn't rushing. She never rushed. Her green checkered uniform was pressed neat, her braids pulled back with small gold barrettes that caught the sunlight when she tilted her head. She carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who knew her place in the world, or thought she did. The swings called to her. 3 empty seats swayed gently in the breeze, their chains glinting silver. She'd been watching from the sidelines for weeks, studying the bigger kids, learning their rhythm. Today felt different. Today felt like her turn. She approached slowly, her black shoes squeaking against the rubber surface. Other children scattered around the playground like birds, some climbing, some running, some clustered in small groups sharing secrets. The air smelled of fresh mulch and the faint sweetness of the cafeteria's apple juice boxes. Everything felt suspended in that perfect moment before recess truly began. Pearline reached the middle swing and paused. She placed her small hands on the warm metal chains, feeling their weight. The seat was exactly the right height. She'd measured it with her eyes a dozen times before. Finally, she whispered to herself and climbed on. The swing cradled her like a gentle hand. She gripped the chains and pushed off with her toes, feeling that first magical lift as her feet left the ground. The playground spread out below her. Children becoming smaller, voices becoming distant. For 12 perfect seconds she was flying. Then the world tilted wrong. "You can't sit there, that's my swing." Norman Johnson's voice hit her like cold water. She looked down to see him stomping toward her. His face twisted with something uglier than anger. He was bigger than most kids in their grade, stocky and solid, with sandy hair that stuck up in places and freckles scattered across pale cheeks that were already flushing red. Pearline's feet dragged in the sand, slowing her swing. "I was here first," she said quietly, her voice steady. "I waited my turn." Norman's pale blue eyes narrowed to slits. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. "I don't care. That's my swing. I always use that one." The playground around them began to shift. Other children sensed the tension like animals sensing a storm. Conversations dropped to whispers. Games slowed to a crawl. Everyone was watching now, though they pretended they weren't. "There are other swings," Pearline said, nodding toward the empty seats beside her. Her voice carried that same calm she'd inherited from her father, the kind that made boardrooms go quiet and investors lean forward. But Norman wasn't a boardroom. He was 8 years old and used to getting his way. "Move," he snarled, stepping closer. "Now." Pearline tightened her grip on the chains. Something in his voice made her stomach flutter, but she didn't budge. "That's not how it works. We take turns." What happened next lasted 3 seconds but felt like 3 hours. Norman lunged forward and shoved her. Hard. His hands hit her shoulders with enough force to send the swing lurching backward. Pearline's grip slipped. The chains burned her palms as she fell, landing hard in the sand with a dull thud that seemed to echo across the suddenly silent playground. The sound broke the spell. Children gasped. Someone dropped a juice box. The rhythmic creak of the other swings seemed to stop all at once. Across the playground, Katie Menard's clipboard clattered to the ground. Her hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. But her feet stayed planted where they were, 30 yards away, as if the sand had turned to quicksand. Pearline sat in the dirt, blinking. Sand clung to her uniform, her palms, her braids. A small scrape bloomed red on her knee where it had hit the ground. She could taste dust on her lips and feel the sting of embarrassment burning her cheeks. But she didn't cry. She didn't scream. She didn't even look angry. Instead, she brushed the sand from her hands with the same careful attention she gave to her homework. She stood up slowly, dusting off her uniform with quiet dignity that made every watching child shift uncomfortably. Norman had already claimed the swing, pumping his legs like nothing had happened. The chains creaked under his weight as he soared higher, a satisfied smirk spreading across his flushed face. "That wasn't very nice," Pearline said simply. Her voice was so calm, so steady, that it cut through the playground noise like a blade. Norman faltered mid-swing, his smirk wavering for just a moment before returning full force. "You should have moved when I told you to," he called back, swinging higher. Katie Menard finally found her feet, hurrying over with a nervous laugh bubbling in her throat. Okay, let's not make a big deal out of this," she said. Her voice pitched too high. It was just kids being kids, right? A little misunderstanding. But every child on that playground knew it wasn't a misunderstanding. They stood frozen in their games, Lucy White by the monkey bars, Kimberly Stone halfway down the slide, Jennifer Beasley and John Deputy clutching the seesaw handles. Their eyes darted between Pearline and Norman, between what they'd seen and what the adult was calling it. Pearline looked at each of them in turn. Her gaze was steady, patient, like she was memorizing their faces, like she was filing away this moment for later. "It's okay, Miss Menard," she said quietly. "I understand." But the way she said it, calm and knowing and somehow older than her 8 years, made Katie's nervous laugh die in her throat, made the other children look away, made the playground feel smaller and heavier than it had moments before. Pearline walked away from the swings without looking back. She collected her backpack from the fence and found a quiet spot under the oak tree, where she sat with her scraped knees pulled up to her chest. She didn't watch Norman swing. She didn't glare or plot revenge. She just sat there, patient and still, while the playground slowly came back to life around her. But something had changed. Something had shifted in the way the children moved, the way they whispered, the way they avoided looking directly at her. Pearline carried more than scraped skin and sandy clothes as she walked to that tree. She carried the moment that would expose Brightwood Elementary's soul. And 3 days later, everyone would learn just how heavy that moment really was. The Freeman mansion sat like a jewel against the Texas twilight, its windows glowing warm against the approaching darkness. Inside, Anthony Freeman knelt beside his daughter on the marble floor of their living room, his skilled inventor's hands gentle as they examined the purple bruise blooming across her knee. "It's fine, Daddy," Pearline said for the 3rd time, but her voice carried that same careful control she'd used on the playground. Too careful for an 8-year-old. Anthony's dark eyes studied not the scrape, but her face. He'd built a tech empire by reading what people didn't say, and his daughter's silence spoke volumes. This wasn't about physical pain. This was about something deeper, something that made her shoulders curve inward and her usual bright chatter fade to whispers. "Tell me what happened," he said softly, settling beside her on the Persian rug. Pearline traced the pattern in the fabric with one finger. "Norman pushed me off the swing. Miss Menard said it was an accident." She paused. But it wasn't. The words hung between them like smoke. Anthony felt something cold settle in his chest. Not anger, not yet, but recognition. He'd seen this before, in boardrooms and business deals, the way people dismissed what they didn't want to acknowledge. "And how did that make you feel?" "Confused," Pearline admitted. "I followed the rules. I waited my turn. But the rules didn't matter." She looked up at him with eyes too old for her face. "Money can't buy fair, can it, Daddy?" Anthony's jaw tightened. His daughter had just learned a lesson he'd hoped to shield her from for a few more years. He reached for his phone. The call to Brightwood Elementary went straight to voicemail. Anthony tried Katie Menard's extension, listening to 3 rings before her tired voice answered. "Miss Menard, this is Anthony Freeman, Pearline's father." A pause. "Oh, Mr. Freeman. How can I help you?" "My daughter came home with a bruise on her knee and a story about being pushed off the swings today. Katie's laugh sounded forced, too bright. Kids will be kids, Mr. Freeman. You know how it is, they get excited, they play rough sometimes. They'll work it out among themselves. Anthony's grip tightened on the phone. My daughter was assaulted by another student. That's not kids being kids. Assaulted is a strong word, Katie said quickly. It was just playground drama. These things happen. Perline is such a mature girl. I'm sure she understands. The dismissal in her voice made Anthony's blood pressure spike. His daughter's maturity wasn't a shield, it was a burden. So will I, he said quietly. I'm sorry. You said they'll work it out. So will I. His voice carried the same quiet steel that had closed billion-dollar deals. We'll speak again soon, Miss Menard. He ended the call and found Perline watching him with knowing eyes. She doesn't believe it matters, Perline said. It wasn't a question. Anthony pulled his daughter close, feeling the weight of her small body against his chest. It matters to me. 3 miles away, in the teacher's lounge at Brightwood Elementary, Katie Menard stared at her cold coffee and tried to shake the feeling that she'd made a mistake. The phone call replayed in her mind. Anthony Freeman's controlled voice, the way he'd said, "So will I," like a promise and a threat rolled into one. She told herself she'd handled it right. Kids fought. Kids made up. Getting parents involved only made things worse, turned playground squabbles into federal cases. Norman was just being Norman. Pushy, sure, but not malicious. And Perline was tough, resilient. She'd bounced back from worse. Except she couldn't remember Perline ever facing worse. And she couldn't forget the look in the little girl's eyes as she'd sat under that oak tree. Not hurt, but bewildered, like someone had changed the rules of a game she thought she understood. Katie pushed the thoughts away. She had bigger problems than playground politics. But the guilt clung to her like humidity. In her pink bedroom across town, Lucy White lay staring at the glow-in-the-dark stars on her ceiling. She'd been there for 2 hours, replaying the moment Norman's hands hit Perline's shoulders, the sound she'd made when she hit the sand, the way everyone had just watched. Lucy's stomach churned. She should have said something. Should have helped Perline up. Should have told Miss Menard what really happened instead of standing there like a statue. But Norman scared her. He was bigger, louder, meaner. And if she spoke up, what if he turned on her next? Her mother had always said the Freeman girl was lucky. Private tutors, fancy clothes, a father who could buy anything. She'll be fine, her mother had said when Lucy mentioned the playground incident at dinner. Rich kids always are. But Lucy had seen Perline's face. Rich or not, she'd looked just as small and hurt as anyone else would. The thought followed Lucy into restless sleep, where swings creaked and chains rattled and 8-year-old voices whispered about fairness that money couldn't buy. Across Brightwood, in a dozen different homes, the emotional fracture line began to spread. Some felt guilt, some felt justified, some felt nothing at all. But everyone would remember the day Anthony Freeman's voice turned cold on the phone. They just didn't know what was coming next. Margaret Chen had been filming her son's first successful monkey bar crossing when it happened. Through her phone screen, she watched the playground unfold like a movie. Children laughing, swings creaking, the golden afternoon light painting everything perfect. She almost stopped recording when her son, David, made it across. But then she saw the push. Her phone captured everything. Norman Johnson's deliberate march toward the swings, his hand shoving Perline Freeman backward, the little girl's tumble into the sand. The frozen tableau of children, the teacher's distant gasp, the way Perline stood up with dignity that made Margaret's chest ache. That evening, Margaret stared at the 47-second clip on her phone. She joined the Brightwood Parents WhatsApp group to stay informed about school events, not to become a whistleblower. Her finger hovered over the delete button. But she couldn't forget Perline's face. Calm and knowing and far too grown up. She hit send. Something happened at recess today. Thought you should see this. The video spread like wildfire through digital veins. Parent to parent, chat group to chat group, each forward carrying whispered commentary. Can you believe this? That poor little girl. Where was the teacher? By 9 p.m., it had reached the Brightwood Elementary administrative email. By 10 p.m., it sat in Principal Dunham's inbox. By 11 p.m., A copy landed on Anthony Freeman's mahogany desk. Freeman sat in his home office, the glow of his computer screen painting shadows across his face. The video played once. Just once. He didn't replay it, didn't pause it, didn't enhance the audio. 47 seconds told him everything he needed to know. His expression never changed. No flash of anger, no clenched fists, no dramatic outburst. Just a stillness that seemed to pull all the warmth from the room. Anyone who'd negotiated with Anthony Freeman would recognize that stillness, the calm before the storm that reshapes landscapes. 3 days, he murmured to the empty office. His voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of absolute certainty. They have 3 days to make this right. He closed the laptop and walked upstairs to check on Perline, who slept peacefully with a book about Marie Curie on her nightstand. Freeman stood in her doorway for a long moment, watching her breathe, memorizing the trust on her sleeping face. Tomorrow everything would change. By sunrise, Brightwood Elementary buzzed with nervous energy. The video had leaked beyond the parent groups. Someone always knew someone who knew someone. Teachers gathered in hushed clusters, administrators held emergency meetings, and children sensed the adult tension without understanding its source. Principal Robert Dunham paced his office like a caged animal, his phone ringing every 15 minutes. School board members, concerned parents, district supervisors, everyone wanted answers he didn't have. Damage control, he muttered to his assistant. We need damage control. But how do you control footage of truth? In the teacher's lounge, Katie Menard sat with a cup of coffee she couldn't drink. Someone had shown her the video on their phone, watching herself stand frozen while a child was hurt, hearing her own voice dismiss it as a misunderstanding. She looked exactly as ineffective as she felt. Kids fight, Sandra Williams from 3rd grade said, trying to be supportive. This will blow over. But Katie couldn't shake the image of Perline's face after the fall. Not hurt, not angry, just disappointed. The face that had haunted her dreams for 2 nights now, asking silently why the rules didn't apply when they mattered most. Across town, the Johnson household erupted in defensive chaos. Norman's parents, Carol and Bradley, had been summoned to view the video by 3 different neighbors. They watched their son's aggressive shove with growing indignation. Not at Norman, but at the situation. It's a childish scuffle, Carol declared, her voice sharp with protective fury. Boys will be boys. That Freeman girl probably provoked him somehow. Bradley nodded vigorously. Exactly. Rich people think they can make mountains out of molehills. Norman was just playing. But even as they spoke the words, they avoided each other's eyes. The video didn't lie. Norman's face in those 47 seconds showed intent, not play. His shove carried malice, not accident. Still, they called the school to demand the witch hunt stop. They scheduled meetings with administrators. They prepared for war, wrapped in the armor of denial that wealthy families sometimes mistake for protection. They had no idea what Anthony Freeman was capable of when motivated. As the second day dawned, rumors spread through Brightwood like spilled paint. The Freeman video. The playground incident. Something big is coming. Children whispered in hallways. Teachers exchanged worried glances. Parents checked their phones obsessively, waiting for updates that never came. In her classroom, Katie tried to focus on lesson plans, but her eyes kept drifting to Perline's empty desk. The Freeman family had kept their daughter home. Family time, the office had been told. But everyone knew better. The countdown had begun, though no one knew exactly what they were counting down to. Except Anthony Freeman, who sat in his office making phone calls with the measured precision of a man orchestrating something larger than revenge. Something like justice. Time remaining. 1 day. Perline Freeman walked through Brightwood Elementary's front doors like she was entering a library where everyone had forgotten how to whisper properly. The hallway conversations didn't stop exactly. They just shifted, became muffled, took on the quality of secrets being shared behind cupped hands. Her green checkered uniform was pressed perfect as always, her braids neat, her backpack settled on her shoulders with the same quiet confidence she'd always carried. But something had changed in the way other children looked at her, or rather how they worked so hard not to look at her directly. In Mrs. Patterson's 3rd grade classroom, The morning felt like walking through thick honey. When Pearline took her usual seat in the second row, the desk closest to hers, occupied by Jenny Mills, scraped backward just slightly. Not enough to be obvious. Just enough to create space where none had existed before. Behind her, Marcus Thompson's pencil case suddenly became fascinating. To her left, Sarah Kim found urgent business organizing her already organized folders. The classroom hummed with the energy of children pretending everything was normal while knowing it absolutely wasn't. Norman Johnson sat 3 rows back, slumped in his chair with studied indifference. His eyes roamed everywhere except toward Pearline, the whiteboard, the window, his fingernails, anywhere but the girl he'd shoved 2 days ago. When Mrs. Patterson called on him to read aloud, his voice came out rougher than usual, like he'd been swallowing sand. The playground video had made him famous in the worst possible way. Kids stared at him differently now too. Not with fear exactly, but with the careful wariness reserved for something unpredictable. He'd gone from class bully to class liability overnight. Lucy White sat frozen in her chair near the window, her stomach churning with words she couldn't say. "I'm sorry. I should have helped. I wanted to say something." The apology sat heavy on her tongue, but every time she glanced toward Pearline, she saw the other children's careful distance and lost her nerve. What if apologizing made her a target too? What if Norman decided she was next? What if the invisible line that now surrounded Pearline became a circle around her as well? So Lucy stayed silent, hating herself a little more with each passing minute. Katie Menard had arrived at school that morning with a battle plan. Act normal, keep things moving, pretend the last 2 days were just a bump in the road. Her voice rang through the classroom with manufactured cheer that fooled no one. "Okay, everyone. Who's excited about our science project?" She clapped her hands together, the sound sharp and hollow. "We're going to learn about gravity today, how things fall and why they fall." The irony wasn't lost on anyone, least of all Katie herself. She stumbled through the lesson with the desperation of someone trying to outrun their own shadow, calling on students with manic enthusiasm, praising answers that barely deserved acknowledgement. But her eyes kept drifting to Pearline, who sat quietly taking notes with the same careful attention she'd always shown. No drama, no attitude, no visible effects of what had happened. Just that same unsettling calm that made Katie's skin crawl with guilt. Principal Dunham had called an emergency faculty meeting before first period, his usually steady voice tight with barely controlled panic. "No one mentions the video," he'd commanded, scanning the assembled teachers like a general addressing troops. No discussions about the playground incident. No special attention to any of the children involved. "We handle this quietly, professionally, and it will blow over." But silence, Katie was learning, could be its own form of cruelty. The unspoken weight of what everyone knew but couldn't acknowledge hung over the classroom like storm clouds. Children were experts at reading adult anxiety, and they absorbed the tension through their skin. By lunch, the cafeteria had developed invisible boundaries. Pearline sat at her usual table, but the seats around her remained empty. Not dramatically, not obviously, just enough to create an island where there used to be community. She ate her sandwich methodically, occasionally glancing up at the swirl of normal childhood chaos around her. When she finished, she pulled out her notebook and began to draw. The image took shape slowly, a swing hanging alone under a cloudy sky, its chains extended but empty, the seat swaying in an invisible breeze. Below it, small flowers pushed through cracked concrete, their faces turned upward despite the shadows. 20 miles away, Anthony Freeman sat in his corner office overlooking downtown Dallas, his phone pressed to his ear with the patience of someone who had learned to weaponize waiting. Wednesday morning, his assistant, Monica, confirmed from the speaker. "The auditorium is booked from 9 to 11. Security will be in place by 8:30. The tech crew will have everything ready for your presentation." Freeman's eyes never left the framed photo on his desk. Pearline at her last science fair, holding a trophy nearly as tall as she was, her smile bright enough to power the building. And the invitations, sent to every family, faculty member, and school board official, required attendance as requested. Freeman nodded to himself. "Thank you, Monica." He ended the call and opened his laptop, reviewing the presentation one final time. 47 seconds of video, followed by 15 minutes that would change everything. Outside his window, Dallas sprawled under an overcast sky, unaware that tomorrow would bring the kind of reckoning that reshapes not just schools, but the people who run them. Time remaining, 18 hours. The morning air at Brightwood Elementary crackled with the kind of tension that makes children walk softer and teachers speak in whispers. Even the custodial staff moved differently, as if the building itself had developed a case of nerves overnight. In the faculty lounge, conversations died the moment anyone new entered. Sandra Williams gripped her coffee mug so tightly her knuckles went white. Mark Rodriguez kept checking his phone for updates that never came. The morning felt like waiting for test results that could change everything. "Has anyone heard anything?" whispered Beth Chen, the art teacher. "About what's supposed to happen today?" Head shakes all around. Principal Dunham had been locked in his office since dawn, his door closed to everyone except the occasional frantic phone call that could be heard through the walls, muffled urgency punctuated by long, uncomfortable silences. Katie Menard's hands trembled as she called attendance, her usually steady voice catching on names she'd spoken 1,000 times before. When she reached Pearline Freeman, the little girl raised her hand with the same quiet confidence she'd always shown, completely unaware that her father was about to turn their world upside down. "Present," Pearline said softly, and Katie's heart nearly broke at the innocence in that single word. Behind her, Norman Johnson slumped lower in his seat. His mother had pulled him aside that morning with wild eyes and frantic whispers about news crews and that Freeman man, and warnings to keep your mouth shut no matter what happens. Norman didn't understand half of what she'd said, but he understood fear when he saw it. And Carol Johnson had been afraid, the kind of afraid that makes parents say things like, "We might need to transfer schools," and "Some people just have too much money for their own good." Now Norman stared at his desk, wishing he could disappear into the wood grain, while the weight of what he'd done pressed down on his shoulders like a lead blanket. Lucy White had barely slept. Every time she'd closed her eyes, she saw Pearline falling, heard the sound of her body hitting the sand, felt the crushing guilt of her own silence. This morning, she'd practiced an apology in the bathroom mirror. "I'm sorry I didn't help you. I'm sorry I was scared. I should have said something." But sitting in class now, with the strange energy crackling through the air like electricity before a storm, the words stuck in her throat. Something big was coming. Everyone could feel it. And Lucy had the terrible suspicion that her chance to make things right was about to disappear forever. At exactly 10 a.m., the loudspeaker crackled to life with a sharp static that made everyone jump. Principal Dunham's voice filled the classroom, tight with barely controlled panic. "All students and staff to the auditorium immediately. This is a mandatory assembly. Please proceed in an orderly fashion." The words hit the classroom like a physical force. Children exchanged wide-eyed glances. Katie's face went pale. From somewhere in the back of the room, someone whispered, "Is this about the video?" Katie stood on unsteady legs, her voice barely audible. "You heard Mr. Dunham. Line up at the door, please." But as they filed out, the hallway buzzed with nervous energy that had nothing to do with a normal assembly. Teachers whispered urgently to each other. Parents appeared from nowhere, summoned by mysterious phone calls. The school felt like a courtroom waiting for a verdict. The auditorium filled with the shuffle of feet and nervous whispers. Students sat in their designated sections while teachers lined the walls like guards. Parents clustered in the back, many checking their phones, all of them looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. Then the side door opened, and Anthony Freeman walked in. He didn't arrive with lawyers or camera crews or the theatrical drama that rumors had suggested. He simply appeared, a tall man in a perfectly tailored navy suit, moving with the quiet authority of someone who owned every room he entered. His presence filled the space like water filling a container, inevitable and complete. Behind him walked a single assistant carrying a laptop and a small projection screen. That was it. No entourage, no security detail, no media circus. Just one father with 47 seconds of video and a promise to keep. Freeman walked to the center of the stage with measured steps, his eyes scanning the assembled crowd. When his gaze found Pearline in the third row, his expression softened for just a moment, a father's love flickering across the controlled mask of a man with business to finish. He reached the podium and stood silent for a long moment, letting the weight of anticipation settle over the room like dust. Teachers held their breath. Students squirmed in their seats. Parents clutched their phones like lifelines. When Freeman finally spoke, his voice was quiet, controlled, and carried to every corner of the auditorium with crystalline clarity. "My name is Anthony Freeman. My daughter is Pearline Freeman. And 3 days ago you failed her." The silence that followed was so complete it felt like the building itself was holding its breath. The real lesson was about to begin. Anthony Freeman stood at the podium like a man delivering a eulogy for something that had died slowly and quietly. His plain gray suit was unremarkable. No designer labels, no flashy accessories, nothing to suggest the billions in his bank account. Just a father in business attire with something important to say. Behind him, a large screen flickered to life, its white glow washing over the hushed auditorium. The assembled crowd, students, teachers, parents, administrators, leaned forward despite themselves, drawn by the terrible magnetism of knowing something significant was about to unfold. 3 days ago, Freeman began, his voice carrying easily through the space without amplification. My daughter experienced something that happens in schools across America every day. Something so common we've learned to call it normal. He clicked a small remote in his hand. The screen filled with Margaret Chen's 47-second video. The playground materialized in digital clarity. Children playing, swings creaking, the golden Texas afternoon that now felt like a lifetime ago. There was Pearline, small and confident, climbing onto the swing with careful determination. The audience watched in frozen silence as Norman Johnson marched across the screen, his face twisted with entitlement and rage. They heard his voice. "You can't sit there, that's my swing." Sharp and cruel in the auditorium's perfect acoustics. Then came the shove. The impact seemed magnified on the big screen. Pearline's small body jerked backward, the chains rattling like breaking bones. Her fall into the sand echoed through the speakers with sickening clarity. Children in the audience gasped. Adults shifted uncomfortably in their seats. But the worst part wasn't the violence. It was what came after. The video captured everything. Katie Menard's frozen stance 30 yards away, her hand flying to her mouth but her feet planted like tree roots. The other children turning to stone, their faces masks of shock and guilt and terrible understanding. The way Norman claimed the swing like a conqueror while Pearline dusted herself off with dignity that shamed everyone watching. When the video ended, the silence in the auditorium was so complete it felt like the building itself had stopped breathing. Even the ventilation system seemed to hold its mechanical breath. Freeman let the silence stretch until it became unbearable, then spoke into it like a scalpel cutting through flesh. "I'm not here to punish children," he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "Children learn what they live. Children do what they see. I'm here to remind the adults in this room what they teach when they choose to stay quiet." His eyes found Katie Menard in the faculty section along the wall. She looked smaller than she had in the video, diminished by shame and the weight of public scrutiny. "Miss Menard," Freeman's voice cut through the air like a blade. "You froze. And in that moment of hesitation, you taught every child on that playground that fairness is optional. That rules don't apply equally. That some people matter less than others." Katie's face crumpled. Tears that had been building for 3 days finally broke free, streaming down her cheeks as she whispered, "I was scared to make it worse. I didn't know what to do. I thought if I downplayed it, it would just go away." Freeman nodded slowly, his expression neither cruel nor kind, just relentlessly honest. "Fear is how injustice survives, Miss Menard. Fear of confrontation. Fear of making waves. Fear of being seen as the problem instead of part of the solution." He turned back to the full auditorium, his gaze sweeping across rows of uncomfortable faces. Every adult in this building knew what happened. Every parent heard the whispers. Every teacher saw the video. And what did you do? The question hung in the air like an accusation waiting for an answer that never came. In the parent section, Carol Johnson pulled Norman closer, his small body practically disappearing behind her defensive bulk. Norman's face was buried against his mother's shoulder. his eyes squeezed shut as if he could will himself invisible. Bradley Johnson's jaw worked silently, his hands clenched into fists that had nowhere to strike. Other parents studied their shoes, their phones, the ceiling. Anywhere but the stage where a man was calmly dismantling the comfortable fiction that had allowed them to sleep for 3 nights. You stayed silent, Freeman continued. You rationalized. You told yourselves that children will be children, that these things work themselves out, that getting involved would only make things messier. He paused, letting his words settle like dust on the assembled crowd. But silence isn't neutral. Silence is a choice. And when adults choose silence in the face of injustice, they teach children that power matters more than principles. That cruelty is acceptable as long as it's quiet enough not to cause a scene. Principal Dunham sat in the front row, his face the color of old paper. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the auditorium's air conditioning. He'd spent 3 days trying to manage this crisis, and now he understood that management had never been an option. Freeman's voice softened slightly, but lost none of its steel. My daughter doesn't need your apologies. She doesn't need your excuses. She needs you to do better. All of you. Because this isn't about one push on one playground. This is about the world you're creating for every child who sits in these seats. The auditorium remained frozen in uncomfortable silence. No one clapped. No one dared to speak. Even the youngest children seemed to understand that something fundamental had shifted, that the comfortable lies adults told themselves had just been stripped away under fluorescent lights and the weight of absolute truth. Freeman stood at the podium for another moment, letting the silence complete its work. Then he clicked off the screen and walked toward the exit, his footsteps echoing in the vast quiet like a countdown to something no one was prepared for. The real lesson had been delivered. Now came the harder part, deciding what to do with it. Freeman reached the side door of the auditorium, his hand touching the metal handle, and the entire room held its breath. Everyone expected him to leave, to exit on that devastating note and let lawyers handle whatever came next. Lawsuits, transfers, media storms, the complete destruction of Brightwood Elementary's reputation. Instead, he turned back. A faint smile played at the corners of his mouth. Not cruel, not triumphant, but something softer. Something that looked almost like hope. Before I go, he said, his voice carrying easily through the stunned silence, there's something else you should know. He walked back to center stage with the same measured steps, but something in his posture had shifted. The prosecutor had become something else entirely. 6 months ago, I bought the land this school stands on. The words hit the auditorium like a physical force. Gasps rippled through the crowd in waves. Principal Dunham's face went from pale to white to gray, his mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled from water. Teachers exchanged panicked glances. Parents clutched each other's arms. Freeman let the shock settle before continuing. The previous owner was facing foreclosure. The school district was weeks away from losing this building, this community, everything you've built here. Carol Johnson's sob cut through the silence, a raw sound of fear and confusion. Norman pressed deeper into her shoulder, overwhelmed by adult emotions he couldn't understand. Around them, other parents began to murmur, whispers building like static electricity. I know what you're thinking, Freeman said, raising his hand for quiet. The rich man is going to close the school that failed his daughter. Justice served. Problem solved. The silence stretched taut as a wire. But that's not justice. That's revenge. And revenge teaches the worst lesson of all, that power exists to punish, not to heal. He moved to stand directly in front of Perline's section, his eyes finding his daughter's face in the third row. She looked up at him with wide, curious eyes, still unaware that she was at the center of something that would reshape her school forever. Instead, I'm rebuilding it. Starting with the playground. His voice grew stronger, more certain. The new facility will be called Perline Park, not as a monument to my daughter, but as a reminder that every child deserves a place where respect isn't optional. The first tear appeared on Katie Menard's face, followed quickly by others. But these weren't tears of shame anymore. They were something else entirely. Freeman reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded document. This morning, I signed papers establishing a $5 million endowment for empathy and inclusion programs. Not just for Brightwood, but for schools across Texas. Because what happened to Pearline happens everywhere, every day, and it's time we admitted that kindness isn't something children are born knowing. It's something we have to teach. The auditorium erupted. Not in polite applause, but in something rawer, a release of 3 days' worth of tension, guilt, fear, and unexpected hope. Parents wept openly. Teachers hugged each other. Even some of the older students began to clap, caught up in the adult emotion swirling around them. Through it all, Norman Johnson remained hidden behind his mother, but Carol's sobs had changed character. They were still tears of shame, but mixed now with something that might have been relief. As the applause began to die down, Katie Menard stood up. Her legs shook, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "Mr. Freeman," she called out, and the room fell quiet again. "I failed your daughter. I failed all the children in my care. I should resign." She took a shaky breath. "I will resign." Freeman studied her for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was gentler than anyone had heard it all morning. "Don't quit, Miss Menard. Learn." He stepped closer to the faculty section, addressing not just Katie but all the teachers lining the walls. "Failure isn't the end of the story. It's the beginning of wisdom. My daughter doesn't need you to disappear in shame. She needs you to be better. All these children need you to be better." Katie sank back into her chair, overwhelmed. Around her, other teachers nodded through their tears. Sandra Williams, Mark Rodriguez, even Principal Dunham, who looked like a man who'd just been handed a second chance he didn't deserve but desperately needed. Freeman returned to the podium one final time. "The construction begins next month. The new programs start this fall. And every day, when children play in Pearline Park, they'll remember that kindness isn't weakness. It's the strongest force in the world." He looked directly at his daughter, who was watching him with shining eyes and a smile that could power the building. "That's the lesson my daughter taught me 3 days ago. She fell down, got back up, and chose dignity over anger. Now it's our turn to follow her example." This time, when Freeman walked toward the exit, he didn't stop. But he left behind something more powerful than fear or shame or even justice. He left behind the possibility that broken things could be rebuilt stronger than before. The real lesson had been delivered. Now the work could begin. The sound of construction filled Brightwood Elementary for 6 weeks, a symphony of hammers and hope that made children press their faces against classroom windows. Where the old playground had stood, with its rusted swing set and worn patches of earth, something beautiful was taking shape. The new swing set rose like a monument to second chances. 3 gleaming seats hung from chains so bright they caught Texas sunlight and threw it back in silver sparks. But it was the engraving on the central support beam that made teachers stop and read it twice. "For those who stand tall even when they fall." Workers had etched the words deep into polished steel, each letter filled with gold that would never fade. Parents walking past after school hours found themselves stopping to trace the inscription with their fingers, reading it aloud to children who already knew it by heart. The construction crew had become part of the school's rhythm. Students waved from windows at the men and women in hard hats who waved back with dirt-stained gloves. During lunch breaks, the workers sometimes ate sandwiches on the new benches, testing their handiwork while children watched from the cafeteria windows. "Can we help?" Lucy White had asked during the 3rd week, standing at the fence with a group of classmates. Her question had traveled up the chain of command until it reached Freeman himself, who'd smiled and said, "Absolutely." The next afternoon, 20 students arrived with paintbrushes and small cans of rainbow colors. Under careful supervision, they painted designs on the bench backs: flowers, butterflies, equations, books, soccer balls. Each child left something of themselves on Pearline Park, turning construction into collaboration. Norman Johnson worked in silence for most of the painting session, his brush moving in careful strokes as he added blue clouds to what would become a sky mural. He'd volunteered quietly, surprising everyone including himself. His mother had signed the permission slip with shaking hands, as if she couldn't quite believe her son was choosing to be part of the solution. The moment Katie Menard had been dreading and hoping for came on a golden October afternoon. She'd been supervising the after-school painting project when she saw Pearline and Norman standing together by the new swing set, talking in voices too low to hear. Katie's heart hammered as she moved closer, ready to intervene if needed. But what she saw stopped her cold. Norman stared at the sand beneath his feet, his face red but determined. "I'm sorry," he said, the words coming out rough and sincere. "For pushing you. For being mean. For all of it." Pearline looked at him for a long moment, studying his face with the same careful attention she gave to math problems. Then she smiled, not the polite smile adults expected from children, but something real and warm. "It's okay," she said simply. "Just don't push anyone else down." Norman nodded so hard his hair flopped over his forehead. "I won't. I promise." They stood there for another moment in comfortable silence, watching the construction workers put finishing touches on the park that bore Pearline's name. Then Norman asked, "Want to test the swings when they're done?" "Yeah," Pearline grinned. "I do." Katie watched from across the playground, tears streaming down her face. But these weren't tears of shame anymore. They were something cleaner, something that felt like redemption earned rather than given. That evening, she sat in her empty classroom working on lesson plans for her new project, Courage and Fairness in Everyday Life. The curriculum had been her idea, proposed to Principal Dunham as part of the school's commitment to change. Weekly discussions about standing up for others, role-playing exercises about fairness, guest speakers from the community sharing stories of moral courage. Freeman had approved additional funding for the program within hours of hearing about it. Learning, his email had said simply, requires practice. The first session was scheduled for the following Monday. Katie had spent weeks preparing, researching, gathering materials. But sitting in her classroom now, watching the construction lights illuminate the nearly finished park through her window, she realized the most important lesson had already been taught. Not by her. Not by Freeman's speech, but by an 8-year-old girl who'd chosen dignity over anger and a father who'd chosen healing over revenge. As the weeks passed, Brightwood Elementary transformed in ways that went deeper than new playground equipment. Parents lingered longer at pickup, actually talking to each other instead of scrolling through phones. Teachers gathered in the faculty lounge to share ideas instead of complaints. Students walked taller, spoke kinder, paid attention to the quiet kids who used to disappear into corners. The community healed not through punishment, but through participation. Everyone had a role in rebuilding what had been broken. Everyone had a chance to be better than they'd been before. And in the center of it all, Pearline Park stood as a daily reminder that falling down wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning of learning how to stand tall. The swing set gleamed in the afternoon sun, its chains singing softly in the Texas breeze, waiting for children who would know that respect wasn't optional and kindness wasn't weakness. Waiting for children who would remember the girl who taught a school to rise. The Texas sun painted everything gold on the morning of Pearline Park's grand opening. Media trucks lined the street outside Brightwood Elementary, their satellite dishes reaching toward a cloudless sky like mechanical sunflowers. Reporters adjusted their ties and checked their cameras, but Anthony Freeman had made it clear. This wasn't about headlines or sound bites. This was about children. A small crowd gathered around the entrance to the new playground. Parents, teachers, students, and neighbors who'd watched the transformation unfold over 6 weeks of construction and hope. The old rusted swing set was gone, replaced by equipment that gleamed like jewelry in the morning light. Benches painted by small hands created splashes of color throughout the space, and flower beds bloomed with native Texas wildflowers that would return every spring. At the center of it all stood a simple ribbon stretched between 2 posts, and beside it, an 8-year-old girl in a green checkered uniform who looked remarkably calm for someone about to cut the ribbon on a park named in her honor. Freeman handed Pearline a pair of oversized scissors, their silver blades catching the sunlight. The crowd pressed closer, phones raised to capture the moment, but the real audience was the children from Brightwood who watched from behind the adults with shining eyes and barely contained excitement. "Ready?" Freeman asked his daughter softly. Pearline nodded, positioning the scissors carefully. She'd practiced this moment in her mind dozens of times, but standing here now, she felt the weight of what it represented. Not just a new playground, but a new beginning for everyone who'd been on that first playground 6 weeks ago. The ribbon fell in 2 pieces, fluttering to the ground like discarded promises. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause, but Freeman only had eyes for his daughter. He knelt beside her as the celebration swirled around them, his voice barely audible above the noise. 3 days ago you fell, he whispered, his hands gentle on her shoulders. Today you made a whole school rise. Pearline looked up at him with eyes that seemed older than her 8 years, wise with the understanding that came from seeing adults at their worst and choosing to believe they could be better. I didn't do it alone, Daddy, she said simply. Across the playground, Katie Menard stood beside the new sign that bore Pearline's name, but her attention was fixed on the children already swarming toward the equipment. She looked different than she had 6 weeks ago, stronger somehow, like someone who'd found her backbone buried under years of playing it safe. The new Courage and Fairness program had transformed her classroom, but more importantly, it had transformed her. She'd learned to speak up when things went wrong, to address problems instead of hoping they'd disappear. The children had responded to her newfound confidence, creating a classroom environment where respect wasn't just expected, it was practiced. Norman Johnson appeared at her elbow, no longer the sullen, aggressive boy who'd pushed Pearline off the swing. 6 weeks of genuine remorse and hard work had changed him in ways that surprised everyone, especially his parents. Miss Menard, he said, tugging on her sleeve. Some of the kindergartners are scared of the big swings. Can I help them? Katie smiled, remembering the boy who'd once taken what he wanted without asking. That's very thoughtful, Norman. Yes, please help them. She watched him jog toward a cluster of 5-year-olds who were eyeing the swings with a mixture of desire and terror. Within minutes, Norman was gently lifting them onto the smaller swings, pushing them just high enough to feel brave, catching them when they jumped off with giggles of delight. Lucy White had been circling the playground for 10 minutes, working up the courage to approach Pearline. She'd rehearsed the words a dozen times, but they felt inadequate for everything she wanted to say. Finally, she found Pearline sitting on one of the painted benches, watching the chaos of opening day with quiet satisfaction. Pearline. Lucy's voice came out smaller than she'd intended. Hi, Lucy. Pearline scooted over, making room on the bench. Lucy sat down carefully, as if the bench might break under the weight of her guilt. I wanted to tell you something. About that day when Norman pushed you. Pearline waited patiently, the same way she waited for everything, with a kind of calm that made other people want to be better versions of themselves. I should have helped you, Lucy said in a rush. I should have said something, or helped you up, or told Miss Menard what really happened. But I was scared, and I just stood there like a statue. She took a shaky breath. But watching what you did, how you handled everything, it made me realize that being scared isn't an excuse for not doing the right thing. Pearline smiled, the same genuine warmth she'd shown Norman during their conversation by the swing set. Fear is normal, Lucy. But you can be scared and brave at the same time. You made me braver, Lucy whispered, and the words felt like a confession and a promise all at once. They sat together in comfortable silence, watching their classmates explore every corner of Pearline Park. Norman was still helping the younger children, his laughter mixing with theirs as they discovered the joy of swings that didn't squeak and slides that gleamed like mirrors. Other children had claimed the monkey bars, the climbing wall, the merry-go-round that spun smooth as silk. As the morning wore on, the media crews packed up their equipment and drove away, but the celebration continued. Children of every color and background played together under the endless Texas sky, their laughter creating a soundtrack of hope that carried across the neighborhood. Pearline found herself back at the swing set as the crowd began to thin. She climbed onto the middle swing, the same position she'd held 6 weeks ago, and began to pump her legs, rising higher with each arc. From her perch above the playground, she could see everything. Katie Menard teaching a group of second graders how to take turns on the seesaw, Norman pushing a kindergartner on the tire swing, Lucy organizing a game of tag that included everyone who wanted to play. Her father stood by the fence, talking quietly with Principal Dunham about plans for the future. The chains sang softly as she swung, a gentle melody that seemed to harmonize with the children's voices below. She thought about that day 6 weeks ago, the push, the fall, the silence that had followed. She thought about her father's speech and the way adults had looked when they realized they could choose to be better. Sometimes, she reflected as the swing carried her higher, the biggest changes started from the smallest push. Norman's shove had been meant to knock her down, but instead it had lifted up an entire community. Her fall had taught a school to rise. She pumped her legs harder, soaring toward the blue Texas sky, and smiled at the beautiful irony of it all. She'd wanted to fly that day 6 weeks ago, and now, in ways she'd never imagined, she finally could. Below her, Pearline Park hummed with the sound of children who knew that respect wasn't optional and kindness wasn't weakness. Children who would remember the girl who'd chosen dignity over anger and the father who'd chosen healing over revenge. Children who would carry those lessons with them long after they'd outgrown swings and moved on to bigger playgrounds. The chains sang their gentle song, and Pearline Freeman soared toward the sun, carrying the story of how a school learned to stand tall.